Last time we learned that we can solve quadratic equations by using the quadratic formula. We simply plug the numbers in for a, b, and c, simplify, and we have the solutions to our equation. Sometimes those solutions contain square roots, other times they're nice integers. But is there an easier way? Is there another way I could solve these equations? Well, there just might be. We can use what we know about factoring in order to solve many quadratic equations. We begin by factoring completely. We factor out the 2 and then use slip and slide. Now we're going to look at each of those factors in the same way we did when we were looking for excluded values in fractions. We look at the 2. 2 can never become 0. It doesn't have a variable attached, and so we're not very interested in it. X minus 3 equals 0, therefore x equals 3. X equals 3 is a solution to the equation. Now let's look at the last piece, x plus 1. X plus 1 equals 0, therefore x equals negative 1 is also a solution to the equation. You might notice that when we use the quadratic formula, we also came up with x equals negative 1 and x equals 3. It just so happens that while the quadratic formula works for every quadratic equation, if you can factor, you have a choice. If your equation can be factored, you could opt to use the quadratic formula. Some people like to do that. Others prefer to use the factoring method, where you factor as we just did, and then solve each piece. Now, let's take a look at our first example. We have x plus 2 and x minus 3, and the product of those. We're simply going to look at each of the pieces, find out where they equal 0, and those will be the solutions to our equation. So x plus 2 equals 0, which means x equals negative 2 is a solution. X minus 3 equals 0, well, that means x equals 3. Now, what does it mean if we have the solutions? Well, take a look off to the right-hand side here. If I were to plug in negative 2, I would end up with 0 times negative 5. 0 times negative 5 is 0. What about if we used x equals 3? If I plug 3 in, I end up with 5 times 0 equals 0. Notice that because the equation is equal to 0, we call these answers, these solutions, the zeros of the equation. Example 2 is very similar. The equation is already factored. Please pause the video here and find the solutions to this equation. Let's see how you did. We have 2x plus 1 equals 0 and x minus 2 equals 0. That gives us x equals negative 1/2 and x equals 2. Those are the solutions to the equation. Now, usually life doesn't come all factored up ahead of time. You have to do the factoring yourself. In example 3, we have y squared minus 49, and we notice that's a difference of perfect squares. We can factor that to y plus 7, and y minus 7 equals 0. Now, we solve each piece. Y plus 7 equals 0, y minus 7 equals 0. And now, we can go through and solve, and we find out that the answers, the solutions to this equation, are y equals negative 7 and y equals positive 7. Example 4 is for you to try. Notice it says x squared equals 25. We need to move everything over to the left-hand side so that we have the equation equal to 0. So x squared minus 25 equals 0, and now we can factor and solve. Please pause the video here and come back once you're finished. When we factored, we had x plus 5 and x minus 5 equals 0. We solve each piece to find the solutions to the equation are x equals negative 5 and x equals positive 5. Example 5 is a beautiful illustration of how things could look. You could have things on any side of the equal sign, and you need to move them around. Now here's a hint. It's easiest to factor if your x squared is positive. So my recommendation is to always move x squared to whichever side will make it positive. In this case, if I add 2x squared to both sides, I have 2x squared minus 11x plus 12 equals 0. Now I can factor x minus 4 and 2x minus 3. I solve each of those pieces, and I find the solutions x equals 4 and x equals 3 over 2. Remember, you could also use the quadratic formula. If you use the quadratic formula, you'd get the same exact solutions. So really, it's your choice. Example 6 is for you to try. It's very similar to example 5. You need to move everything over to one side. Please work on that right now. Come on back when you're finished. We'll see how you did. Let's see how you did. We began by adding 2x squared to each side, and then we factored the trinomial. We found that it factored to x plus 3 and 2x minus 1. We then solve both pieces, and we end up with x equals negative 3 and x equals 1/2. If you had used the quadratic formula, you would get exactly the same results. Because they factor, you had a choice. You could factor, or you could use the quadratic formula. So here's what you need to know. You can always use the quadratic formula to solve any quadratic equation. If your equation can be factored, then you have a choice. You can use the factoring method that I just showed you, or you could use the quadratic formula. If you decide to use the factoring method, begin by factoring and then finding the zeros. The zeros are the solutions to your equation. This is everything you need to know about using factoring to solve quadratic equations.